At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. The translation came as musical intervals rendered into words, each phrase carrying the rhythm of something originally beautiful, now described to someone who couldn't hear music. Their expansion is a discordant note in the galactic symphony. But be assured, the grid is flawless. It is the embodiment of order. Nothing moves within our sphere unseen. No ship, no signal, no ambition can hide from the perfection of our senses. 48 hours later, the cockpit of the Gaelic Whisperer smelled like ozone and bad decisions. Rory Callahan had been awake for 22 hours, and the coffee he'd brewed at hour 14 had long since gone cold in the mug in its magnetic clamp beside the primary console. He hadn't drunk it. He'd forgotten it existed. The diagnostics screen showed 412 separate system checks, and he was on number 389, which had a variance of 0.003% in the Echo Drive's secondary calibration array that wasn't technically outside tolerance, but that he intended to understand before he was satisfied. He understood it 11 minutes later. Thermal expansion in the mounting bracket. Negligible. Irrelevant. Documented. He moved to 390. The floor panels beneath his chair bore a long scuff mark from the day he'd misjudged the width of a power coupling and dragged it across the deck. 8 months ago, during the first week of the build, when the Whisperer had been a skeleton of frame and intention rather than a ship, the scuff had remained. He'd considered it a kind of christening. He heard the docking bay's inner hatch cycle, the distinctive 3-beat pressure equalization, and didn't look up. "You're still at it," Eldon said. 390 of 412. Eldon Marsh dropped into the co-pilot's seat with the economy of a man who had been getting in and out of cockpits for 30 years and had long since stopped thinking about it. He was older than Rory by 2 decades, built like someone who had once been very strong and had simply stayed that way out of habit. He picked up the cold coffee, considered it, set it back down. "The drive works," Eldon said. "I know it works. I want to know it works the way I think it works. That's a different thing." "It is." "Yes." Rory pulled up the next subsystem. "The difference between a thing functioning and a thing functioning as designed is the difference between luck and engineering. Out there," he gestured vaguely toward the asteroid's rock wall and everything beyond it, "I don't want luck." Eldon was quiet. The reactor's low hum moved through the deck plating, steady as a pulse. The Whisperer was alive in the way good ships were alive, not with personality exactly, but with presence. "The Gilded don't make mistakes," Eldon said. "The grid hasn't failed in 60 years of documented operation." "And you think the Echo Drive beats it?" "I know the Echo Drive beats it." Flat certainty, the tone of a man stating a physical law. "The grid works by detecting anomalies, a ship's drive signature, hull thermal output, the electromagnetic shadow a vessel casts moving through space. Extraordinarily sensitive, but it's looking for the wrong thing." He finally looked up. "It's looking for what's there. The Echo Drive gives it something to find that isn't us." Eldon studied the quiet geography of the console between them. "And if you're wrong?" "Then we find out very quickly." Eldon's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been inside Gilded space twice. Before the grid, both times, which means what I know is archaeology. They've changed. Everyone who's gone in since the grid went active." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "I know." "The cartography logs from the Ethel Archive," Eldon said. "The full extent of Gilded expansion, the unannounced colony systems, the resource networks. You understand what the intelligence means. You understand why Rozovensky doesn't have a contingency that involves us coming back empty-handed." Rory cleared System 391 and moved to the next. "I understand," he said, and this time it carried a different weight. The briefing room was a 6 by 4 meter box of gray composite paneling, lit with institutional thoroughness that left no shadow anywhere. Rory and Eldon stood before the holographic projector as Admiral Zed Rozovensky's image resolved from static into something stern and specific, a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had restructured his posture around it.
"Before we proceed," Rozovensky said without preamble, "I want you to hear something."
He keyed a secondary feed. A face appeared that was not Rozovensky's. Golden-skinned, smooth, serene, with a completeness that Rory's instincts registered as threatening rather than peaceful. The eyes were slightly too still. The intercepted gilded transmission was low resolution, but the condescension in it survived the compression intact. The translation came as musical intervals rendered into words, each phrase carrying the rhythm of something originally beautiful, now described to someone who couldn't hear music. Their expansion is a discordant note in the galactic symphony, but be assured, the grid is flawless. It is the embodiment of order. Nothing moves within our sphere unseen. No ship, no signal, no ambition can hide from the perfection of our senses. The feed cut. Rozovensky's face returned.
"That's what we're up against. Arrogance built on a foundation of technological dominance. Their main grid is well documented. What worries me is what we don't know. Rumors of purity projects on their core worlds. New sensor architectures designed to detect signatures that aren't harmonious. Their word, not ours. We don't know what it means yet."
He outlined the objective without wasted words. The Ethel Archive, orbital above the Gilded Capital at Cygnus X-1. The master stellar cartography logs, kept in the original because the Gilded trusted their grid and had never seriously entertained the possibility of theft.
"Questions,"
Rozovensky said. "The Purity Projects," Eldon said. "Any indication of what they're scanning for specifically?"
"Dissonance. That's the only term in the intelligence. No technical definition."
Rozovensky looked at Rory.
"What we do know is that the Purity projects appear to be a secondary automated system, not part of the main grid. The grid logs and ignores minor recurring anomalies. This system watches the ignored data. When a logged anomaly recurs past a threshold number of times, it activates and investigates why something persistent enough to repeat itself was considered too harmless to examine."
He paused.
"That's a question for your echo drive."
Rory said nothing for a moment. He pulled up a definition on his console without thinking about it, the reflex of an engineer encountering an unfamiliar term. Dissonance, lack of harmony, a tension or clash resulting from the combination of disharmonious elements. He read it twice. "Understood," he said, and filed it. Rozovensky held his gaze a moment longer than the transmission lag required.
"Don't fail,"
he said, and cut the feed. The gray room was very quiet. "Encouraging," Eldon said. The bay doors of Asteroid Station Curate opened like something drawing a slow breath, and the starfield beyond was absolute and indifferent, and astonishing in the way it always was, the way Rory had never quite gotten used to, despite years of looking at it. Eldon took the manual controls. His hands moved across the board with a quietness Rory had noticed before and respected. Not the showy precision of someone performing competence, but the invisible efficiency of a man whose body had simply absorbed its work. The Whisperer lifted from her cradle with a low vibration that faded as the landing struts retracted. And then she was moving, slow and certain, toward the open doors. Rory brought the primary systems up in sequence. Power distribution settled into cruise configuration. The Echo Drive's standby indicators glowed steady amber. He checked them against his memory of diagnostic item 389 and found them exactly as they should be. The station noise dropped away as they cleared the bay, the industrial percussion of a base that never stopped working, the comms chatter, the distant clang of hull maintenance. And then the doors closed behind them, and there was nothing. Space had a quality of silence that no recording had ever captured accurately. It wasn't simply quiet. It was the absence of the medium through which sound traveled, and the difference was felt somewhere deeper than the ears. Rory had tried to explain this once and given up. Eldon, he suspected, had known it long before him. The gilded border manifested on sensors as a change in the data, a region where the background noise of space became structured, patterned, the grid sweeps laying their invisible geometry across the void with the regularity of something that had never been interrupted and did not expect to be. "First sweep in 40 seconds, Rory said. Eldon held their approach vector, steady and unhurried. "Ready when you are." Rory activated the echo drive. The system came alive with a precision that satisfied him every time, not because he doubted it, but because satisfaction was the appropriate response to a thing working exactly as designed. The drive sensor array detected the incoming sweep, sampled its frequency, its pulse width, its characteristic waveform, and in the 0.3 seconds before it arrived, composed a response. Not silence. Silence was itself an anomaly the grid would notice and investigate. Instead, the echo drive broadcast back the signature of a pocket of interstellar hydrogen, diffuse and unremarkable, drifting on a trajectory consistent with the local stellar wind. The sweep passed through them and returned to its source, carrying the news that nothing was here, only hydrogen, patient and vast and entirely without ambition. 2 gilded patrol vessels slid past at 400 kilometers, their running lights a slow amber pulse, their sensor arrays painting the Whisperer repeatedly and finding only hydrogen and silence. Rory watched them go. His hands rested on the console without tension. "First veil," he said quietly. "We're through." Eldon said nothing, but his shoulders settled by perhaps 3 millimeters, and Rory noted it and said nothing in return. The Gaelic Whisperer moved deeper into gilded space, silent as a held breath. 6 hours inside the border, they got their first close look at what that space contained. The Gilded flew in formation the way mathematics flew in formation, inevitably, precisely, without the small human deviations that accumulated in every other fleet Eldon had ever observed. The patrol squadron that crossed their path held its spacing to the meter, each ship equidistant from its neighbors, the whole formation rotating on a shared axis with the slow, unhurried perfection of a mechanism that had never been asked to improvise. Eldon watched them on the visual feed and said nothing for a long time. "The lead ship adjusted course 0.4 degrees 12 minutes ago," Rory said, not looking up from his secondary console. "All 9 ships completed the same adjustment within 0.6 seconds of each other. Networked. Completely. Individual decision-making is probably considered a flaw." He pulled up a passive scan of the formation. "The drive harmonics are synchronized too. They're not just flying together, they're functioning as a single organism." "It's soulless," Eldon said. "It's extraordinary." Eldon looked at him. "Both things can be true," Rory said. "I'm allowed to admire engineering I find philosophically objectionable." They passed a gilded way station 2 hours later, a structure that might have been beautiful if beauty required warmth, which Eldon had always privately believed it did. The station was a perfect octahedron, each face a mirror surface, its docking arms extending with radial symmetry in 8 directions, each arm identical to the last. The light it reflected was cold and even, the light of a star filtered through something that had removed all its irregularity. There were no visible markings, no signs of individual habitation, nor the accumulated visual noise of a place where people actually lived. It looked less like a space station and more like a proof of concept. "No art," Eldon said, "anywhere. Not on that station, not on the ships, not so much as a painted number." "Individuation would disrupt the harmonic pattern," Rory said. Rory said it the way he said most things, as information rather than judgment. "If every ship is identical and every station is identical, The sensor grid reads a consistent baseline. Variation is what gets you noticed.
Oh, it's what makes you human. Rory considered this.
Or both.
The Gaelic Whisperer moved through it all like a rumor, the echo drive feeding the grid a continuous stream of unremarkable phenomena: drifting hydrogen, a slow-moving fragment of ice, the electromagnetic shadow of a long-dead comet. The gilded sensors swept them with metronomic regularity and found nothing worth cataloging. Eldon had trusted his life to a great many things over 30 years. He was still deciding how comfortable he was trusting it to a variance of 0.003% in a mounting bracket. He didn't mention this to Rory.
Cygnus X-1 delivered something beyond overwhelming. It was simply too large to process emotionally. The black hole at its center was invisible, as black holes were, but its presence organized everything in the system around it. The accretion disk, a vast, slow spiral of superheated matter, glowing in gradients from deep red at its outer edge to a white-gold ferocity at the inner boundary that the visual filters struggled to manage. Around this impossibility, the Gilded had built their crown. Ring worlds, 3 of them, concentric, each inclined at a precise angle to the accretion disk's plane, their inner surfaces presumably habitable and certainly vast. They were gold, not metaphorically gold, but actually gold, or something that caught light the way gold did, their surfaces gleaming in the accretion disk's radiance with an opulence so extreme it circled back around to something that felt almost like threat. Capital ships moved between them in the same lockstep formations as every other Gilded fleet, and there were many, more than Eldon had seen in any single intelligence summary, more than he suspected the Coalition knew about. "There," Rory said. The Aethel Archive occupied a stable orbit between the second and third ring worlds, a sphere, perfect as everything the Guild built was perfect, the size of a small moon, its surface an obsidian black that absorbed the accretion disk's light rather than reflecting it. Across this darkness ran threads of luminescence, blue, white, and precise, tracing the data conduits beneath the surface the way a circulatory system traces beneath skin. It pulsed slowly. It looked alive, and in a sense, Eldon supposed it was. Around it, patrol drones in a layered shell, capital ships at 4 anchor points, sensor arrays he could count and several he suspected he couldn't. The drone coverage alone would have made any conventional approach suicidal. Even with the echo drive running flawlessly, the geometry of it was uncomfortably tight. "How long do we have before the next capital ship rotation?" Eldon said. 41 minutes. The rotation creates a 17-minute window where the sensor coverage on the Archive's southern hemisphere drops to 60% of nominal. 60% of nominal for the Gilded is still better than anyone else has built, yes, but that's why we have the Echo Drive. Eldon was already adjusting the approach vector. South Polar region. There's a maintenance conduit access point that the Archive's own schematics, the ones Intelligence stole 14 months ago, indicate as serviced on a 48-hour cycle. Last service was 31 hours ago. Eldon did the arithmetic. That's cutting it close. Everything about this is cutting it close, Rory said without apparent concern. I need you on manual from here. Precise and slow. The Ghost protocol requires a drift rate under 4 meters per second relative to the Archive's surface or the echo signature degrades. Eldon put his hands on the controls. The Ghost was Rory's improvisation, not something he'd designed into the Echo Drive's original specifications, but something he'd worked out in the 6 weeks of transit and spent 12 days coding and testing in simulation. It was elegant in the way that solutions born from necessity were elegant, compressed, purposeful, and slightly alarming to anyone who thought about it too carefully. Where the Echo Drive's standard mode broadcast a static false signature, the Ghost protocol broadcast a repeating anomaly, a sensor ghost, the kind of minor, consistent glitch that appeared in sufficiently complex detection systems, the phantom reading that recurred on a predictable cycle and was therefore, by definition, not a threat. The Gilded Zone systems would have protocols for logging and ignoring exactly this kind of noise. Their perfection, in this specific instance, was their vulnerability. The Archive's outer drone shell's sensors swept them 4 times as they drifted inward. Each time, the Echo Drive returned the ghost signature, the same reading, the same intensity, offset by the expected interval. Log, ignore, continue. They're filing us, Rory said quietly, watching the telemetry. Cross-referenced as a known anomaly, sector designation Delta 7. We have a designation. Eldon kept his hands very steady on the controls and thought about nothing but the numbers on his approach display. The maintenance conduit was a recessed channel in the Archive's obsidian hull, approximately 60 centimeters wide, covered by a panel of the same material as the surface around it, and invisible until you knew exactly where to look. Rory knew exactly where to look. "Hold here," he said. "Relative zero velocity." Eldon matched the Archive's rotation with movements so small they barely registered on the control surface. The Whisperer hung in space 40 meters from the Archive's hull, the obsidian surface filling the viewport, the blue-white conduit threads running past them in slow, luminous rivers. "Firing the leech," Rory said. The data leech was a probe the length of Eldon's forearm, magnetically tipped, trailing a filament of superconducting cable so fine it was effectively invisible. It crossed the 40 meters silently and embedded itself in the conduit access panel with a vibration too small to hear, only felt through the cable spool as a single definitive tick. "Contact," Rory said. "Beginning transfer." He watched the counter initialize and felt the familiar tension of a process he could not rush. The Gilded used quantum-locked data storage. The leech couldn't simply copy the cartography logs. It had to entangle with the archive system and migrate the quantum state incrementally. A process that was inherently sequential, inherently slow, and left no trace of a breach. It was the reason they'd chosen the leech over every foster option. It was also the reason the counter moved the way it did. It moved slowly. Eldon watched the drone shell and did not allow himself to watch the counter. The maintenance drone came from the Archive's eastern quadrant, not on the scheduled patrol route, which was the first thing that concerned him, and it was moving with a directness that suggested purpose rather than routine sweep. It was smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of an atmospheric shuttle, its optical array a bank of sensors across its forward face, each one rotating through its sweep pattern with the same mechanical precision as everything else in Gilded space. "Rory? I see it! The Echo Drive doesn't work on direct optical, I know." His voice was completely level. "Don't move." The drone's approach brought it along the Archive's surface at a distance of perhaps 15 meters, its optical array sweeping in an overlapping pattern that would have caught anything reflective, anything warm, anything that didn't match the surface it was examining. The Whisperer's hull was non-reflective by design, a composite coating that absorbed rather than scattered, chosen precisely because stealth in visual spectrum was as important as stealth in electromagnetic. In the shadow of the Archive, against obsidian, she was the color of nothing. The drone passed. Eldon became aware that he had not breathed for approximately 90 seconds. "Transfer at 60%, Rory said. He breathed. He held the controls. He did not look at the counter. At 100%, Rory said quietly and without ceremony, "Retract." The leech came back along its filament. The counter stopped. Rory pulled up the data package confirmation and checked it against the intelligence summary of what the Archive's cartography logs were expected to contain, and then checked it again, and then sat back in his chair. "We have it," he said. "All of it." Eldon began the careful drift away from the Archive's hull, the same patient nothing that had brought them in. His hands were entirely steady. He was quite proud of this. "Good," he said, which was all he trusted himself to say at that particular moment, and kept his eyes on the numbers. The drift away from the Ethel Archive was the longest 40 minutes of Rory's life, which was saying something given the 40 minutes that had preceded them. He sat with the data package confirmed and encrypted in the Whisperer's secondary core, and he watched his boards, and he said very little. The Ghost Protocol continued its quiet deception. Delta 7 logged and ignored. Unremarkable, the sensor ghost that the Gilded Systems had described was beneath their attention. The drone shell receded behind them as Eldon held their drift, 4 meters per second, patient as erosion. "Capital ship rotation in 9 minutes, Rory said. "I know. When the rotation completes, the southern hemisphere coverage goes back to full nominal. "I know. We should be clear of the outer drone shell by then. "I know, Rory." Eldon's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who was counting the same numbers independently and did not need them read aloud. "Let me fly." Rory let him fly. The outer drone shell passed behind them at minute 7. The capital ship rotation began at minute 9, 4 massive vessels pivoting in their anchor positions with the slow, inevitable grace of things that had no reason to hurry, sensor arrays sweeping back to full coverage of the archive's southern hemisphere, and finding the same thing they always found: the archive, the drones, the cold luminescence of the conduit threads, and no one who wasn't supposed to be there. At minute 12, Eldon increased their speed for the first time since leaving the archive. Not dramatically, a gentle, steady increase, the kind of acceleration that looked like natural orbital drift to anything watching. But Rory felt it through the seat, and a moment later he noticed his hand. It was trembling, very slightly, barely visible, the kind of tremor that only appeared when the body decided the emergency was over and began returning from wherever it had been. He looked at it for a moment, then set it flat on the console until it stilled. "Don't," Eldon said. "I wasn't doing anything." "You were relaxing. Don't." Rory put his eyes back on the boards, but his hand remembered what it had just told him. The data was theirs. The archive was behind them. The Ghost Protocol was holding. The mission, impossibly, against all reasonable probability, successful, and it was very difficult to argue with a hand. He managed it for another 23 minutes. The wave hit them as they cleared the orbit of the system's third planet, and Rory had never seen anything like it. It wasn't a sensor sweep. He knew sensor sweeps, knew their frequency profiles and pulse widths and the characteristic shape they made in the data. This was different. An oscillating energy discharge, broadband, washing through the Whisperer's hull the way radiation washed through matter. Not around it, but through it, penetrating rather than reflecting, and the echo drive had no answer for something it couldn't intercept at the surface, because the surface wasn't where this was operating. The lights in the cockpit flickered. On the visual feed, a moon that had been dark and unremarkable for the entire duration of their approach blazed suddenly into activity. A structure on its northern face, angular and large, powering up with the decisive speed of something that had been waiting rather than dormant. Arrays extended, emitters oriented. A second oscillating discharge followed the first, stronger, more focused. The alarms came in a cascade, one triggering the next, the cockpit filling with sound and red light in the space of 2 seconds. Rory was already at his boards, reading the damage assessment before the alarm tones had fully registered as alarm tones. The Echo Drive's status indicator had gone from green to amber to red in the time it took him to move his eyes to it. Critical failure. The primary emitter array had gone down. The secondary was attempting to compensate and failing. The Ghost Protocol had dropped entirely, the repeating echo signature dissolving mid-cycle, and whatever Delta 7's lost transmitted data had looked like to the Gilded Sensor Network, it no longer looked like weather. "Rory," Eldon said, "I see it." The tactical display updated. Red icons, appearing as though the system had been full of them all along and had simply been waiting for permission to show itself. Interceptor class, 6 of them, launching from the station on the dark moon with the coordinated speed of ships whose pilots shared a network and made no individual decisions. A 7th and 8th followed. They were sleek and golden, and they were already calculating an intercept. The gilded comms channels, which had been the measured, melodic background of ordered space, erupted into something that retained the chiming quality of their language and now sounded entirely like an alarm. "I need time," Rory said. "Working on it," Eldon said, and pushed the throttles forward. The Gaelic Whisperer was not a fast ship. She had been built for stealth, not speed, and stealth and speed were largely incompatible design priorities, which meant that the 8 interceptors behind them were faster by a margin that Rory's part of his brain that was still doing mathematics found discouraging. Eldon's response to this was to not travel in a straight line. The evasive maneuver was gut-wrenching in the specific way that maneuvers performed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing were gut-wrenching, not random, not panicked, but deliberate in ways that Rory's body registered as chaos, even as his mind recognized the logic. Eldon was reading the interceptors' formation, anticipating their vector corrections, threading the Whisperer through the gaps before the gaps closed. Weapons fire came in bursts of directed energy, coherent and precise, and each burst hit empty space where the Whisperer had been a fraction of a second before. "Primary emitter is gone, secondary's failing with it," Rory said, his hands moving through the bypass sequence. "I'm trying to reroute through the tertiary array, but the oscillating discharge did something to the frequency calibration that I don't—" He stopped, recalibrated, started again. "The discharge was specifically targeted at the Echo Drive's operating frequency. They knew what they were looking for." "The Purity projects," Eldon said, banking hard to port. "Dissonance detection." "They built something that detects active deception rather than physical presence." Rory pulled the tertiary array's diagnostic, read it in 4 seconds, and felt the particular cold clarity of a problem that was worse than he'd initially assessed. "The tertiary array is intact, but it's running on the same frequency architecture as the primary. If I bring it up without recalibrating, the detection array will burn it out in seconds." "How long to recalibrate?" 11 minutes. Eldon said something that Rory chose not to register. 2 weapons bursts crossed close enough that the hull sensors registered heat. The interceptor formation was tightening, the gap between the Whisperer and her pursuers closing with the steady mathematical certainty of a problem that didn't care how clever you were. Rory worked. The recalibration was not 11 minutes of simple steps. It was 11 minutes of interdependent adjustments, each one affecting the next, a sequence that required his complete attention, and he was attempting to perform while being shot at, which was not a variable he had included in his design specifications. "Hold on," Eldon said in a tone that had stopped meaning hold on and started meaning I am about to do something you will not enjoy. Rory held on. The construction debris field was the remnant of a Gilded Ringworld expansion project, prefabricated structural sections in various stages of assembly, some completed and drifting on station-keeping thrusters, some half-built frameworks of golden alloy, and one section, a massive flat plate of structural composite the size of a landing field, tumbling slowly on a decaying orbit that brought it periodically close to the system's 3rd planet. Eldon took them straight at it. What followed was not something Rory's design specifications had included. Eldon fired the Whisperer's magnetic grapple, a docking tool rated for cargo handling, not combat maneuvering, and caught the plate's leading edge at the precise moment its tumble brought it perpendicular to their vector. The angular momentum transferred instantly. Violent. The ship pivoted around the contact point like a stone on a string, the grapple taking a lateral stress load that Rory would later read in the hull logs and decide not to share with anyone. And then the cable released, and they were moving in a direction that bore no relationship to the direction they had been moving 3 seconds before. Eldon had read the tumble cycle with his eyes rather than his instruments. He had timed the grapple with his hands rather than a computer. He had been right. The interceptors peeled off, not because they were outmatched. Their ships were faster, and they knew it. Because the maneuver made no mathematical sense, and beings who flew by consensus and network and shared calculation could not immediately model what they had just seen. The Gilded comms chatter cut out entirely for 1.8 seconds. Rory had never heard them go silent before. Then the channel erupted. 4 seconds before the interceptors recovered, Eldon used them. Rory's hands, to his considerable relief, were not shaking. He completed the recalibration in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. "Bring it up," Eldon said. Rory brought up the tertiary array. The Echo Drive's status indicator moved from red to amber. The interceptors were already correcting, already rebuilding their intercept solution. "It's partial," Rory said. "Maybe 40% of original capacity." "Can you build on it?" "While we're moving, yes. I need 7 more minutes." "You have 4. Eldon said, reading something in the tactical display that Rory was trusting him to read. "Make it work." Rory made it work. The net was closing with the patience of something that didn't need to hurry. Eldon could see it on the tactical display and feel it in the geometry of the weapons fire. Less frequent now, more deliberate. The interceptors no longer trying to destroy them so much as hurt them. Every vector he opened, they covered. Every gap he found, they filled. There were 14 of them now, 2 flights of capital interceptors and a pair of heavy escorts that had come around the ring worlds with the slow, unstoppable authority of ships that had never needed to be fought, because they had always had enough numbers to be patient. He flew. He flew the way he had flown for 30 years, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated physical memory of 10,000 hours that lived in his hands rather than his head. It was not enough. "They're learning," he said. "They're networked," Rory said from behind a wall of data he'd been building for the last 6 minutes. "Every evasive pattern I see you use, they model and distribute to the entire formation in under 2 seconds. You can't surprise them twice with the same move." "I know." He banked hard, threading the Whisperer between 2 interceptors that had anticipated his course correction and adjusted to catch him, and hadn't quite adjusted fast enough. 2 seconds. The modeling time was the only edge he had left, and he was spending it on survival rather than escape, which was the definition of a losing battle. "How's the echo drive?" 63%. It's not going to matter. They're using the dissonance array to guide the intercept formation. They can see us regardless of what the echo drive broadcasts. We could go fully dark and they'd still have us." Eldon didn't answer. He found another gap, pushed through it, gained 4 seconds. Outside the viewport, the Gilded Interceptors moved to close the new hole with the seamless coordination of water filling a depression. He was very good at this, and he was going to run out of gaps before they ran out of ships, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it was a weight that settled into the cockpit and made the air feel different. "There's something in the charts," Rory said. Eldon glanced at him. Rory had pulled the stolen cartography logs onto his secondary display and was moving through them with the rapid index finger scanning motion he used when he was looking for something specific and hadn't found it yet. His other hand was still managing the echo drive rerouting, 2 processes running in parallel, the way his mind worked when it was running hot. "Talk to me." "The Gilded classify it as a navigational hazard." He stopped scrolling. "Designation K-77, a nebula, 11 light minutes from our current position. Their logs flag it as a region of unpredictable gravimetric shears and chaotic plasma discharges. Standard navigational warning, keep clear." "The nebula won't hide us from the dissonance array." "I know." Rory looked up from the display. He had the particular expression he wore when he had arrived at a conclusion and was checking it for flaws before presenting it. Careful, inward, slightly elsewhere. "But look at the raw sensor logs, not the navigational summary. The plasma discharge pattern is non-periodic. The gravimetric shears are non-repeating. Every reading is different from every previous reading. There is no baseline. There is no consistent signal." Eldon understood where this was going and felt his stomach move. "Rory." "The echo drive works by mimicking natural phenomena. The nebula is natural phenomena. Every variety of it, simultaneously, chaotically, without pattern. The dissonance array looks for deception by identifying signals that don't belong in their environment." He paused. "Inside that nebula, everything belongs. Everything is noise. Everything is chaos. The array would have nothing to calibrate against. We would be invisible not because we're mimicking the background. We'd be invisible because the background is us." Eldon looked at the tactical display. The net was tighter. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the remaining gaps became theoretical rather than actual. "A slip space jump 11 light minutes into a region of non-periodic gravimetric shears." "Yes!" "The tidal stresses alone are significant, I know." "The jump drive needs a clean gravitational gradient to calculate emergence. If the gradient is chaotic, the calculation fails and we emerge wherever the physics decide to put us." "I know, Eldon," Rory said with the directness of someone who had already done the calculation and was not pretending it was a good one. "I also know that the Gilded won't follow. It's not a risk calculation for them. They don't take risks they can't model. A region of non-periodic gravimetric interference is not a calculated danger to the Gilded. It's just noise. Their logic forbids it, not their courage. Their logic. The way they think makes it literally impossible for them to see that space as navigable." Weapons fire. Close. The hull sensors registered heat, and Eldon pulled them sideways with a violence that strained the inertial dampeners, and the gap that remained was now theoretical. "We have to run toward the chaos," Rory said. "It's the only direction they can't follow." Eldon looked at the nebula coordinates on the display. 11 light minutes. K-77. Unpredictable gravimetric shears. Chaotic plasma discharges. A jump that every piece of rational piloting experience he possessed told him was the kind of thing that turned ships into debris fields. He had spent 30 years surviving by knowing which risks were worth taking. He thought about the 14 interceptors. He thought about the net. "Plot the jump," he said. The Gaelic Whisperer went into slip space at an angle that Eldon would later describe, with considerable understatement, as suboptimal. The jump drive's calculation was the cleanest Rory could produce, given the gravitational interference already bleeding into their position from K-77's outer edge, which meant it was not very clean at all, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The transit lasted 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. The forces involved were not the smooth, pressureless displacement of a textbook jump. They were lateral, oscillating, wrong in the specific way that wrong felt different from merely uncomfortable. Something in the port hull made a sound that Rory catalogued as structural and decided not to investigate until they were through. The lights went out entirely for 1.3 seconds, which the ship's log would later confirm and which felt, in the moment, like considerably more. Then they were through, and the viewport filled with K-77. Rory had processed the nebula as data, sensor readings, spectral analysis, gravimetric profiles, and data had not prepared him for the experience of being inside it. The gas clouds were not the diffuse, monochromatic haze of popular imagination. They were vast ribbons of incandescent color, pink and deep blue, and a gold that bore no resemblance to the cold, gilded aesthetic. This was warm, alive, the gold of something burning rather than something polished. The ribbons twisted around each other with a slow, enormous grace, lit from within by plasma discharges that arced between them in curves kilometers long, silent and brilliant, like lightning that had forgotten it was supposed to be brief. A plasma arc crossed the viewport at a distance that the sensors measured as 300 kilometers, and that Rory's eyes insisted was much closer. The light it threw across the cockpit was pink and shifting, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. And they were sitting in the middle of it in a damaged ship with a compromised jump drive, and he held both of these things simultaneously and found, to his mild surprise, that the beauty was not diminished by the danger. "They didn't follow," Eldon said. Rory checked the tactical display. The Gilded Interceptors had stopped at K-77's outer boundary, 14 ships, holding formation, their sensors painting the nebula's outer edge and returning noise. They held there for 4 minutes. Then, with the decisive coordination of a network reaching a consensus, they turned and went back to the ring worlds. "You think they're gone for good?" Eldon said. "For now." Rory watched the lost icon fade from the display. "Their operational doctrine requires them to report the anomaly and await instruction before taking independent action. They won't improvise a blockade without consensus from their command structure. That's not cowardice. It's how they're built. It gives us a window." "How long a window?" "Long enough." The cockpit was very quiet. "Port hull stress fracture," Rory said, reading the damage report. "Secondary, not critical. The jump drive took a lateral load it wasn't ready for. I'll need to run a full diagnostic before we use it again." "Echo drive?" 63% and holding. It will be enough to get us home." He looked at the nebula through the viewport. Another plasma arc, further away, painting the gas clouds in slow-moving blue. "We'll need to navigate out manually. No slip space until I've checked the drive." "Manual it is." Eldon settled into his chair with the particular quality of stillness that Rory had come to recognize as his version of relief. "It's not the worst office I've ever worked in." They flew out of K-77 over the course of 6 hours, picking their way through the gravimetric shears by feel and sensor, Eldon reading the gas clouds the same way he read everything, with his hands slightly ahead of his understanding, trusting the accumulated knowledge that lived in his body. The plasma arcs kept their distance. The ribbon clouds parted. The Gaelic Whisperer emerged from K-77's outer boundary into clear space with a port hull fracture, a compromised jump drive, and a data core containing the full Gilded Stellar cartography logs, intact and verified. Asteroid Station Quirt received them on a priority docking approach, the bay doors opening before Eldon had finished the request, and Rory understood from this that someone had been watching for their return. The Whisperer settled into her cradle with the slightly asymmetric thump of a ship that had taken a lateral load she hadn't been designed for, and the landing struts locked, and the reactor began its cooldown cycle, and it was over. Admiral Zed Rozovensky was waiting in the bay. He looked up at the ship first, the long scoring along the port hull where the stress fracture had propagated, the mottled surface where the heat of near misses had done things to the coating that Rory was going to need to assess carefully, the general appearance of a vessel that had been through something and had declined to discuss it. Then he looked at Rory and Eldon. Rory handed him the data core without ceremony. Rozovensky took it and held it with the particular stillness of a man receiving something he had not been certain would ever arrive.
"I'll get this to the cryptographers,"
Rozovensky said. "The checksum is verified on our end, Admiral. Standard Coalition encryption wrapper is active. Everything that was in that archive is in that core." Rory paused. "Complete." Rozovensky looked at the data core for a moment. Then he looked at the ship again, and at both of them, and Rory had the sense of a man reassessing something he'd believed he understood. "The echo drive failed," Rory said. "They've built a dissonance detection array, specifically designed to identify active deception in the electromagnetic spectrum. It burned out our primary emitter in a single pulse. We went in as a stealth mission and came out as something else."
"And yet," Rozovensky said,
"the nebula, K-77, they won't go in. The gravimetric interference is non-periodic, which means their sensor system can't establish a baseline, which means the environment reads as pure noise. They can't navigate noise. It's not a risk they can calculate, so it's a risk they won't accept." Rory paused. "The echo drive works by mimicking natural chaos. What I didn't fully understand until today is that we don't have to mimic it. We can live in it. We can go places they physically cannot follow, because the part of them that would make the decision to follow can't process the information that would make the decision possible." Rozovensky looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eldon, who had said nothing, who was leaning against the Whisperer's hull with the economy of a man conserving something he'd spent freely and needed to replenish.
"Their perfection," Rozovensky said. "It has limits."
"It has a specific, exploitable, consistent limit," Rory said. "They built a system for detecting deception. They haven't built a system for tolerating uncertainty. Those are different problems, and we've been treating them as the same one." He thought about the plasma arcs, the ribbon clouds, the gold that was warm rather than cold. "We don't need to beat their order. We need to operate where their order breaks down. We need to be the noise in their signal." Rozovensky set the data core down on an equipment case with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something fragile. He looked at the Whisperer once more, the scoring, the fractures, the evidence of a mission that had not gone as planned and had succeeded anyway.
"Get some rest," he said. "Both of you. Then come back and tell me everything about the nebula."
He walked away down the bay. Then he stopped. He turned back and looked at Rory, and then at Eldon for a long moment, and said nothing more. Then he walked on. Rory looked at Eldon, who was looking at the Whisperer with the expression he reserved for things he trusted. "She held," Eldon said. "She held," Rory agreed. The bay hummed around them, industrial and purposeful, the accumulated noise of a base that had never stopped working, and neither of them moved for a while, standing in it, letting it be enough. After a time, Rory became aware that he was thirsty. He thought about the mug of coffee in its magnetic clamp, cold since hour 14, forgotten since shortly after. When they got back to the ship, he decided he was going to make a fresh one.
Hello, my all members, subscribers, followers. I said that my channel is low original, and I have submitted some videos in English to change the motto of my channel. Please subscribe my channel, view my videos, and share in all of your friends on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, every social media platform to send my video and view more videos. Viewers in my video, please help me to provide some time to spend with me. Thank you to all members who can subscribe my channel and support me some time. Please view more video and entertainment video. Please help me sometime to support my channel because I am a low middle class family. Please help me.